Welcome to Mapping the College Audition. I am your host, Charlie Murphy, director of MTCA. That's Musical Theater College Auditions. Check us out at mtca.com. And today we've got Cara Rose DiPietro on the podcast. For our newer listeners, in these artist episodes, we aim to explore the paths to success that artists are forging for themselves and to try to tease out how their theatrical training helped them to blaze their trails. And for our audio listeners, nothing will have changed that much. But for our video listeners, our video viewers, welcome. You may have known for a while that you've had this option to watch our interviews on YouTube. And if you didn't know that, now you know. But as of today, we are now trying to release the entire episode via video when possible. This means you'll get to see my beautiful face on these intros and our takeaways. But also, I believe for our Apple Podcast and Spotify listeners, and probably some other podcast platforms as well, you're going to have access to the video automatically. So I'm saying all this assuming that it worked smoothly on our upload and everything technically went according to plan. But I believe you can essentially just click on the episode itself and you'll be able to see this via video. It worked for me on Apple Podcasts, so I'm hoping it will work for all of you. Now, I encourage all of you sane humans out there who prefer audio only to please do listen to the audio only. Who's got the time or the inclination to stare at my face while I talk to you? That's crazy behavior. I would always rather a phone call than a Zoom call. That's me personally. But of course, some people do seem to prefer it. They like seeing their interviews on video. So we're going to try to keep giving the people what they want. But no, for myself, I definitely do prefer my podcast to be in my pocket and in my headphones while I'm working out, doing the dishes, driving, whatever it is. So please don't injure yourself while doing any of those things and trying to stare at my static face. Let's hope that works out well for all of you. Okay, for my students out there, for our juniors and younger, I hope you're all scheduled for our junior intensive coming up next month. We're really excited for that. But for our seniors, this is your month. Here we are. As this episode releases, we are coming up on New York City Unified this weekend. I'm excited to see many of you at our kickoff meeting and in the green room. You might even get to meet my daughter if we're graced with a cameo, as we have been in years past. But I will say, I think a ton of this episode content is going to be really relevant to you during this time of year. So if you're someone who maybe pauses an episode, you don't listen to all of them, this might be a great one for you to listen to this month. I always think of January as kind of a month of wellness in a big way, both in terms of trying to kind of avoid sickness, but also in terms of how do we bring a healthy body into the room, physically, vocally, psychologically. And we'll talk about that a lot in this week's episode, as well as in an upcoming episode that I'm really excited about, which will also be released during our audition season. But I gave you all a bit of homework on this from last week's episode. That was our episode with NYU. For those who don't listen to all your episodes, that's okay. But I gave you this a bit of homework to try to come up with a prep strategy that addresses what you need from a psychological perspective. I hope you did that. And if you didn't, there's still time. But please do put some real thought into it. What do you need to be fully alive and available in the room? I'll talk about this a bit more in the takeaway after you hear Cara and me discuss it. But please don't neglect that psychological part of it. For those of you who are attending New York City, Chicago, and LA Unifieds, you will get MTCA warm-ups each morning that will address all three of these areas of the physical, the vocal, and the psychological. But hopefully those MTCA warm-ups are not the entirety of your plan, right? What are you doing right outside the room before it's your turn to go? Do you have music that you love? Do you have a mantra you recite? Do you have a picture that you look at in your audition book that brings you to your happy place? Just please don't have the answer be anxiously scrolling social media right before you walk in the room. I beg of you. We'll talk about that a bit in this episode. And then also, what are you doing inside the room before you start your pieces? How do you set yourself up for success as much as possible from a mental perspective so that you can have that lived in, active version of your pieces, as opposed to feeling like you're just playing the tape on something you recorded yesterday in the room or that you've been recording for the past year? This stuff is hard, but it's critically important to your success. And I hope you enjoy all the ways that Cara and I discuss it in this week's interview. So without further ado, here's Cara Rose DiPietro. Well, we are so excited to be joined by Cara Rose DiPietro. Cara is a graduate of Elon University, graduated just a few short years ago in 2021, making me feel old. Already, she's been on television in Elsbeth as a co-star and worked at theaters like Arena Stage, Connecticut Stage Company, New London Barn Playhouse, as well as a number of cool workshops that we found on social media, but that have not made your way to your website. So, Cara, that's your first note of the podcast. Get them on the website. Whatever you've done, get it on the website. No, welcome on the pod. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
We're so excited to have you for a number of reasons, some of which we were just talking about in our pre-show. But I have a recurring pledge to have young people on the pod as I only get older and older. And as fun as it is to hear about Jesse Mueller or Andrew Rannells or whatever and how they did their college experience, they went to school in a very different environment than you did, both in terms of what the process was and the business that they were entering into. So not only for your youth, but also I think really cool for we've had a number of young people on now, but most of them have ended up being MTCA alumni. Like we had Helen Chen on, who's doing great right now. Go Helen, Talia Suskauer, et cetera. But I think really helpful to have some non-MTCAers on to talk about your process and how you may have navigated it differently. So I'm excited to do all of that. And that's all before we get into some of the specifics in terms of your areas of expertise, like mental health advocacy. We'll talk about some of your social media influencing, fashion. We know that people want me to talk about fashion. This is what they've always wanted. So I can't wait. So we're going to see where the conversation goes. But for the first half, I do really want to take you through the college process, especially into your early career where we are now, from that large scale perspective, and then maybe get into some of those specifics. So before I do that, before we get into the college journey, can you give me a little prologue on you? Give me like a 60-second catch up of like getting you to 16 years old. You're growing up where? How do you discover theater, et cetera?
Yeah, so both of my parents were actually performers.
Oh no,
I
Kara.
know. So they studied it in college. Basically, they had done it their whole lives and they wanted to do other things, but they still loved it. And so they still
Hmm.
wanted to study it in college. So they both got dual degrees. They studied theater. My mom went on to be a teacher. My dad went on to study law, but they met in the theater program at their college.
Yep.
They ended up getting married, having my brother and I, and so we were raised like on cast albums, like Your Good Man Charlie Brown and Big
Hmm.
River and Godspell and Joseph and all that kind of stuff. And so from a very, very young age, my brother and I were just exposed to it.
Yep.
And my mom was from New Jersey. And so from a young age, we would go to stay with my grandparents and we would go into the city and we would get to see the original Broadway cast of Beauty and the Beast, like
Hmm.
things like that, that were so, we had no idea how lucky we were at the time. And so from such a young age, I was so exposed to it. And I took my first dance class when I was 3, and it is literally all I've ever done. It
Huh.
is the only thing, like, from that moment on, and I was so fortunate as well to have 2 parents that knew that, they saw it, and they supported it,
Oh, Kara, you're
which
really freaking me out here because my 3-year-old, I have a 3-year-old daughter, and she's literally on Thursday taking her first dance class.
oh,
And I wonder if I'm
no!
setting her on a slope that is unrecoverable from. She's two
Yeah, you're
actor
ready.
parents. Oh, disaster. This is a
Get
disaster.
ready.
All right, so skip me forward from 3 to 16 or 17 or whenever you really first started thinking about the college process. I'd love to hear sort of what was your approach to this? If you knew what you were looking for in a school, like if you had a mission statement of I'm hoping for a school like this, I'd love to hear that. And then just talk me through like how did you end up approaching it with parents, of course, who were knowledgeable, but you talk about in your TED Talk, we'll talk about this of just it is such a daunting process. It's why an MTCA exists. Like how was that experience of what you were looking for in terms of the college process?
Yeah, I mean, it was crazy. I mean, as you very well know. So I actually worked with a coaching company in Boston where I'm from.
No, there's not allowed to be other coaching companies, Carrot. No, keep going. Go ahead. Yeah.
And so I auditioned for 17 schools. And the way that I kind of approached it is I tried to be very intentional about not falling in love with one school because I
Yeah.
knew that that was a surefire way to have my heart broken. So I had like I had 7 reach schools. I had 7 schools and I was like, if I could get into any of these schools, cool. And I'm going
Yep.
to try really, really hard to not fall in love with any of them. And if I get into any of them, great. If I don't, okay. I
Yep.
will look at other ones and hopefully I will get into other ones and we will go from there and figure it out. And I was fortunate that I got into 2 of those schools and
Yep.
I decided between those schools and they just so happened to be the ones that I went to visit and I was like, well, shit. Like I
And what were the two, if you don't mind me sharing? So
it
Elon
was
is where you ended up going.
Elon and Boco were the 2
Hmm.
schools and
Yep.
which could not be any more different schools. Like when you think I'm from Massachusetts.
Yep.
And, like, when you just think about those 2 schools as a whole, they could not be more
Right.
different in terms
Location, how much liberal arts there is. Yeah, for sure.
of, like, size, all of it.
Yep.
And,
I
like,
love that we say that, though. Of course, like that's true for only people who would listen to this podcast. They'd be like, "Oh, I totally agree." From any layman, they'd be like, "Those are both
the
BFAs."
same.
What are you talking about? They're the same. Like a little tiny. Like I talk about something. I'll be like, "Oh, the difference between an NYU and a BOCO, it's going to be enormous." It's like, well, but also not that enormous in the large scale thing. But
Yeah.
continue. I know what you mean. Yeah. But so,
Um,
what made you end up going with Elon as opposed to BOCO?
Honestly, so Elon was the last school I auditioned for. It's
Hmm.
my 17th audition, and I, to this day, still like would gripe because I would say half of my class auditioned early and got in early, and it was
Hmm.
my last audition. And so I was like, ugh, so bitter the whole time, because everyone else got to cancel all their other auditions. But I just remember walking onto that campus, and a big thing with me too was when I was younger. I I mean, even so now, was so competitive with myself.
Hmm.
And it was really important to me that I went somewhere that wouldn't foster a culture that would make me feel like I was pitting myself against others and that would
Hmm.
make it feel like it was pitting me against my peers.
Yeah.
And it was something about Elon that made me feel like I was exactly who I was. Like it was one of those gut feelings like when you leave somewhere and you were I was like it was literally kind of what I just said. I was like, "Well, shit,
Yep.
this is the school I have to go to." I just
Yep.
knew it in my gut. And so which was so hard because I was like, "Oh my gosh, like this is I can't fall in love with
Yep.
this school." But I knew in my gut that that was the place for me. I was like, "This place values me as a human first." I
Yep.
knew that, and that was really important for me.
Yeah, and we'll definitely have a couple questions about competitiveness later, so I'll try to save some of those. But did it feel like maybe Boko, because of the size, would feel like maybe it was going to encourage some of that intra-class competitiveness because it was just bigger? Because you're like, now I'm going to have more classmates to compete with.
Sure, I think there also was kind of this added aspect of like, well, at BoCo, my whole life would be this. It'd
Hmm.
be my whole world. Whereas at Elon, I would have to get a liberal arts
Have to get
education.
a
I
minor.
would
Yeah, for
have to
sure.
take French. I would have, and the cool thing about getting a music theater degree at Elon, it's one of the only programs where you can study abroad, and it doesn't like have to be a theater study abroad. Like
Yep.
because of the way that they have like a January semester, for some reason, it is one of those schools that really allows you to kind of really have a college experience if
Yep.
you want to. And so and at the time, I think about it now and I'm like, gosh, that's such an important thing for me now in my adult life.
Hmm.
But that was another really important thing. I was like, well, if I go to BoCo, it'll be my whole world. And when theater is my whole world and my whole life, it tends to be
Hmm.
all consuming. And
Mm.
then it gets extremely competitive and I get in my own head. And it's not that I feel that competitiveness with other people. I feel it with myself
Yep.
and I project it onto others. It's a me
Yep.
thing. Whereas at Elon, I could have that part of my life
Yep.
and I could also have the other parts and I would have to remove myself from it. So I would have to have that balance, which I like.
It's so well said, and I love that you're already giving us some Elon specifics. I have a couple questions about that in a second,
Mhm.
but I'd love to talk about, you talked about your TED Talk, and I encourage anyone who wants to view it. You can, I don't know, go to Kara's social media is probably the easiest way, or go Google it. But it's a great like 15-minute TED Talk, and we'll talk about it's about sort of your mental health and your eating disorder that you struggled with and like, maybe still struggle with. Timing wise, was that already happening for you as you were approaching the college audition process, or did you discover so you knew by 16, 17, this is something I'm struggling with? Yeah.
Yes.
What was, I just love to hear, like, what was the relationship with your parents in kind of supporting you going into this industry knowing that you have this diagnosis?
It was fascinating. I
Yeah.
mean, it's very fascinating, especially because I mean, it's something that I have struggled with for more than half of my life. And when we really like kind of addressed it head on, it was the summer going into my senior year.
Of high
And
school, this is.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so then, and that is obviously
That's
when
what's
you
happening. Yep.
start going, like, that
Yep.
is when things start going head on. But we knew, like, I was lucky that I had parents that were theater people. Like they
Yep.
knew what the college audition process was. They knew how it would go. Like my mom was so funny. She would we would go to auditions and she would leave me because she was like, "You
Hmm.
know what you're doing." Like unified, she was like, "All right, see you at lunch. Like go
Love
for
that. Yep.
it." She
Yep.
knew. She was like,
Yep.
I'm not,
And she's
you
like, I'd
know."
want space as an actor myself. I'm giving you the
Yeah.
space you need.
She
Yeah.
was like, "You don't need me here. Like you're fine."
Hmm.
Um, but it was tough. I mean, I remember like her kind of leaving me there and it was a different ball game because
Hmm.
especially like when when it comes to like treating an eating disorder specifically, you can either specifically between the ages of like 17 to 19, when you're 18, you can be treated as an adolescent or an adult.
Uh-huh.
And the difference between that is, are your parents in control or are you? And I was treated as an adolescent because I was living with my parents. So
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have control over my choices, what I was doing, how, like, which made sense at the time. And then I got to college and then
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh, all of this is mine.
Yeah.
New ball game. So when I think in hindsight, I'm like, oh, maybe we should have maybe I should have set some things up in hindsight to kind of
Uh-huh.
prepare me for this.
Transition you into owning it.
Of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah.
Um, but like I can't imagine how difficult that must have been, like kind of my mom driving away and being like, I can't do anything. Because at
Yeah.
that point, it truly is. It's like this is
It's
the
yeah. Yeah.
first step in your life. You are the only one that can do this for yourself, especially in these collegiate programs, which at that time too, like we weren't having these discussions.
Right. Yep.
So the culture of these kind of things weren't exactly things that we were aware of and talking about.
Yep.
So like they didn't even really know what I was walking into, and neither
Yep.
did I truly.
Yeah, and I mean, I talk about you like you're so young, but I do think, yeah, even 3 or 4 years later, some of those conversations would have been different. Some of the conversations we had on the podcast of professors talking about mental health, and I'm like, I knew you 6 years ago. You weren't talking this way. You weren't. That wasn't an understanding that you had, or that wasn't in the public consciousness. It's so interesting. I love that idea of a transition. We talk about that a lot. I think of that more from post college into professional life, of like so much structure from high school, often through college when it's a BFA program, because there's so much structure to that. And then you wake up in the void and go, what do I do with my days? And I guess I'll work out in the morning. What's next? Wait for auditions to come in. Like that can be a really hard, transition. But of course, in college too, especially where you're at a liberal arts school and you're all alone for the first time, far from home, that can happen in the college world too. But I guess I kind of wonder, and maybe I don't know what of what your parents' experience was, but knowing the fact that they do know what this industry can be, like to me, it would feel a little bit like, if I know enough about football now, of like, if my kid's prone to concussions, I'm like, oh, it'd be really hard to let my kid play football. Like, was there ever a conversation where you said, I want to do this, and your parents were like, are you sure that this is the right profession for you to go into, or that knowing that this was something that was going to struggle, or was that it was more about let's manage how we do that, not like if we do it?
Yeah, I was always managed, how are we gonna do it? It was
Yeah.
always like, how? Um, and I think because they saw that in me, I think also, and this is such a strange thing to say, like, I think specifically my mom and my dad always saw like the person that I am today and the work that I do today in me from a very young age, in the
Hmm.
things that I did. Like, I think that they just saw that kind of person in me. And I think that that was always kind of in their mind, even if it wasn't in mine. And so I think that was always kind of their thought process. It was like, okay, how do we manage this?
Yep.
Um, Instead of like, is this the right thing? They also just like they believed in me so hard, and what I, had to offer, that they were like, it's not a question of like if, it's a
Yeah.
question of how.
Okay, that's beautiful. I mean, I love that, and I love that for your parents. I ask it really because it's a question our parents often ask, a version of like, I want to support my child. I know how hard this industry is, and then often it'll be some reason, not specifically this mental health issue, but it could be, I just know they have a lot of anxiety, or they have a lot of, and they go, I know this is a profession that would be hard for people with anxiety, or people, she doesn't deal well with rejection. I know this is a profession full of rejection. It's like, so that instinct to sort of protect our kid, but not wanting to rob them of their potential dreams and their passions. And I know that's a conversation parents often struggle with. Yeah. Okay. But let's get to Elon. So you started giving me some of those specifics. Was it then, it was the dream as you fell in love visiting? Did it live up to those dreams? Let's maybe talk about, were there areas where you felt like, oh, here's where it was even beyond what I expected? Any areas where you felt like, ooh, I expected it to be this and this was harder than I thought?
Yeah, I mean, I loved my class. We always joke that we like didn't realize how good we had it until like the classes below us came in and we like really looked around. Like we were so
And they
fortunate.
all sucked, is what you're saying. Your
Like,
class was
and it's
good and
just
they were
like
all bad? No,
we
I
we
got it.
just like generally really didn't have any problems in our class.
Yeah.
And then like when other classes would have problems, that we were like, oh wait, we never dealt like we just genuinely, we were so fortunate that we had so many and the joke was, we would always say we were so competitive with ourselves that we really weren't competitive with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And we were always so supportive of one another. And even when we did like have our tiffs, like in freshman showcase, when we were all just like absolutely crazy and sleep deprived and nuts, like I remember like coming back sophomore year and just being like, yeah, no wonder we all got in a fight. Like, we were crazy. Like,
Hmm.
um, so that was so wonderful. And like, that surpassed my wildest dreams. Something that also I really loved about Elon that one of the big reasons I went to Elon was because of how they structured their senior showcase.
Hmm.
And the way that that happens is that they bring, instead of like going to New York and doing something, they bring casting directors and agents to you.
Hmm.
And of course, ours looked a little different because I was a 2021 senior. And so
Hmm.
that was the post during kind of COVID
Yep.
year. Um,
Maybe the worst of COVID. That feels like the
yeah,
2020s, we didn't quite know what it was, but 2021 was like the height of
yeah.
the business days of that. Yeah.
But I mean, regardless, we figured it out and it still
Yep.
worked out well for us. But
And
that
did
was
you end
another
up getting an agent from Showcase?
it
Awesome.
we were all really concerned about how it was going to work, and to be so honest, it the results yielded exactly the same as they did every other year, and it was
Huh.
actually because it was structured in a different way, it was a bit more in our favor. It was just
Hmm.
easier just because of the way it typically was structured.
Yep.
Honestly, I always talk about my senior year, like the bar was here. So when it was here, we were
Yep.
great. And so
Yep.
all things considered, like things worked out pretty well. We figured it out. We threw spaghetti at the wall and pretty much it always stuck.
Yep.
But that absolutely lived up to my expectations. There was so much opportunity to make things and create, um,
Yep.
which I really loved. And a big thing that Elon encouraged and would invite people to come do was summer stock and summer
Yep.
work. I worked, with the exception of obviously COVID summer, which I was going to work and then COVID happened and none of us worked. Was like I had work lined up every single summer I was at
Hmm.
Elon for summer stock work, which means I graduated with a resume and
Yep.
professional credits that have served me throughout my entire career.
Yep.
Um, like post grad and beyond. And
How
Elon,
much beyond is there? Post grad and we're
yeah,
in.
like,
How many would be more beyonds? Beyond is like tomorrow now. Like, get me that much beyond.
but that has been so helpful. And Elon really fosters that in the
Yep.
sense of like they would fly casting directors down to audition
Totally.
all of their students. So
Yep.
that was something that I didn't anticipate and I loved.
Yep, I love it. Well, and I want to talk a little bit more about that idea of competitiveness. I love that you described Elon as maybe less competitive than some other places in terms of fostering that environment. I know something you talked about in your TED Talk, though, of like, hey, this in this business at least, and some of your experience at school still ended up feeling competitive. What does that mean for you? I guess maybe for the actor, for the non-actor parents, and then sort of layman going, what does it mean by this is a competitive business? Like, what does that word mean to you when you use it?
So I know for me, something that I am constantly having to tell myself, I have to work on it once a week at least, is somebody else's success is not my failure.
Yeah.
And so that is how like competitiveness also like often fosters its like and rears its head in me. I feel
Yep.
like it can kind of show up in different ways. I know some people struggle in college with universities and professors pitting students against one another. And like
Yep.
I never experienced that at Elon. I never
Yep.
really saw it. And like that was my own experience. And I could have a totally different experience than someone else, and I can't speak to another person's. That's never how it showed up for me. But when I think about competitiveness, I think about looking at all the people around me and thinking, why am I not doing what that person is doing? Why are they doing
Hmm.
this and why am I not doing that? Why is that person working harder than me? I'm not working hard enough. I have to be doing this. I have to be doing that.
Hmm.
So it's such an internal thing. And I feel like that competitiveness fosters this culture of like this hustle and this grind that is just this like cycle and cycle and cycle
Yep.
of us just like feeling this incessant need to prove ourselves to
Yep.
ourselves and everyone around us that we're doing enough.
Yep.
Um, and so that's kind of what I think of, which is such a kind of a weird take because competitiveness also often feels like a thing that relies on other people, but I think it
Yep.
just comes from us.
Yep. No, it's well said. And I do think it's one of those words that different people hear differently with different connotations. I mean, we certainly, I'll use that word sometimes negatively. If I were to describe a school as it was a competitive environment, that might sound like a negative thing. Though when we label our tiers, as all back in the day, 20 years ago, when we were labeling the tiers of different schools, we call them most competitive and competitive. Part of the reason to sort of help parents understand this is such a competitive business when you're talking about admission rates and stuff like that. But then, of course, we wouldn't want to say this is a competitive school in a way of saying we wouldn't want people to compete with each other. But and then on the flip side, it's like to some extent, you do have to find that drive for yourself of what does motivate you and push you forward. So the idea of competing with yourself, I think in life, we all have to find what gets you up out of bed and what gets you going, sitting at your chair or going to the gym or whatever the thing is that you're going to need to be doing for yourself. There's an element of competition, but it sounds like maybe inherent in that there for you and I think not alone for you, there's an element of compare and despair that sort of sneaks into the idea of this is a competitive environment, meaning my motivation is coming from outside as opposed to inside my own
Absolutely,
school.
that's
Yeah.
absolutely it.
Yeah. And do you want to talk a little bit? I know we're going to go into it in a second, but that some of your anorexia came back, it seemed like during college in those experiences, now alone in that more competitive environment and sort of how you then ended up dealing with that.
Yeah, it's something I always say about when it comes to, like, eating disorders just in general across the board is that they're really good shapeshifters,
Mm-hmm.
and at the end of the day, as most, like, things and addictions go, because at the end of the day, like, that's what an eating disorder is, it's an addiction. But it's a tricky one because it's not something that you can stop. It's not something you can cut out, it's something that you actively have to do every single day.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's a control thing. At the end of the
Yep.
day, you turn to this thing to because you're feeling out of control about something else in your life. That's why you do it.
Yep.
Um, and so I look back at that time and I was looking around and I was like, okay, maybe I can't be the best. Maybe I can't be the most talented. Maybe I can't do this. Maybe I can't do that. Maybe I didn't get that part. Maybe I didn't do this, but I can be the best at this. This
Yep.
I can be the best at. And
At limiting my food intake.
yeah, I was like, I can be the best at all of this about
Yep.
playing this game and knowing how it works because I've done it for so long.
Yep.
Um, and that's what I would turn to. And so that throughout the course of, and it's interesting because until I had got to college, that was really never what it was about. It had never really had anything to do, it had nothing to do with my career or my life,
Uh-huh.
or like it had never had any ties. Um,
Uh-huh.
and then in college, it became completely about my whole identity.
Uh-huh.
In that sense, it became a huge part of that. And
And you
so
think triggered by watching some other people struggle with some of the same
I
ideas that
think it
when you
was,
say, I
yeah.
see you limiting your food intake, oh, that's something I can win at, or that's
Yeah.
something that I,
Well, it was
yeah,
because it was so rewarded and it was so praised and it was such a culture thing. It was just
yeah,
how it was. It was so expected. That was how it was. And I think I say to people who don't struggle with it, or maybe who struggle with it and don't totally understand what it is, those alarms don't go off. But when it is
mm-hmm,
something that you struggle with, it's like immediately the fire alarms start going off and you
yeah,
clock it so immediately, even if it's not even said. So that was something that kind of made that, like, those alarms kind of go off in college
yeah,
and kind of sent me down that road and turned the car to start driving in that direction.
yeah. No, and the reason I wanted to frame the conversation in this way, because I think it was similar to some of my experiences in college, which maybe I'll talk about too, but is that I think sometimes people would have the image of the kind of environment that would drive someone into this must be, and then parents are going to picture like it's like fame or it's like, in some of the same ways that I remember like people used to talk about high school bullying and they were picturing it was like the jock slamming the nerds up against the locker. I'm like, that's not quite what it's like. There's a subtler, it's a different, when you talk about culture, it's often subtler than that. It's often not. And maybe especially the reason I'm thinking framing it this way is that you said I went to Elon because it felt like a warmer, safer environment. So it's not necessarily something that you can just avoid in your school choice of going, well, I won't go to the school where that exists. I'll go to one of the schools where it doesn't exist. And it's like, I don't know that it's going to be easy to root that out at any program that's related to this business because it's not necessarily something that I think the school is instilling as much as we instill in ourselves.
And it can. I've heard many stories about, people and professors being like,
Right. Being the
people being
cause of it for sure.
praised and being
Yeah.
like, "Oh, you've lost weight, like, great job." And
Oh,
that
I will
only
tell you some of those very stories later
Oh,
in this podcast
yeah,
for sure.
all the
Yeah.
time. And
Yeah.
it's tough, something that I always am very adamant about when I talk about this part of my life is I will never, ever, ever speak for those people and speak for people who have had those experiences because at the end of the day, regardless of how I see myself, how I have ever viewed myself, I know that this industry will always, always, always view myself as a small, thin, cisgender white woman.
Yeah.
Like that is regardless of how I see myself, because that is like my experiences have afforded me
Yeah.
that kind of a privilege. And so like my experiences at college, when I think back at them, like are so much less severe than so many
Totally.
people, who had so many experiences where they were praised and rewarded and were finally afforded opportunities when they started struggling with these things. But I think it also just kind of opens up a door for a bigger conversation because especially, something that I talked about in my talk is like when my senior year I started to become a bit more like kind of open and honest about it because it was something that people knew about and because I am a pretty open and honest person. Um it was so shocking to hear about how many people were
Yeah.
struggling with the same.
Yep.
And it's fascinating to me nowadays how many people are talking about it and how many
Yep.
people are actively listening.
Yep. So true. Okay, let's take a short break and then we're going to dive deeper into this conversation on the back end. So back in a flash. Okay, we are back with Cara Rose DiPietro, and I want to dive deep into this health journey, and we'll probably bounce around a little bit. But I'd love to start off with just like with where you are with it right now, and I don't know if it feels like this is something that feels I've solved or I'm continuing to solve in different aspects of my life. But like, what have been your broad scale conclusions about how you can navigate this while training and working in this business? So, are there tips or other things for young people if they're struggling with it in terms of what you've been able to learn from this experience?
Yeah. I mean, something that I remember when I was in college, kind of my one of my biggest fears was like, okay, well, if I choose to recover, if I
Hmm.
choose to get my body to a place where it is healthy, if I choose to take care of myself, no one will ever want to work with me again.
Hmm.
That was the conclusion that I drew. And I was like, if I put my health first, I can't do this. Like, I don't want this enough. It was like, I
Uh-huh.
just kind of talked myself into these circles. And so, something that I say to myself and also to others, because sometimes I still tell myself that. Sometimes still find myself catching like, no, you don't have time to like.
Hmm.
You still need to spend another hour doing this thing. You can't go to bed yet. You need to do X, Y, and Z.
Right.
Is that like putting your health first and your career second is actually what putting your career first looks
Hmm.
like.
Hmm.
Because at the end of the day, there is no career to be had if you're not here to have it.
Hmm.
Which is something that if I had heard that when I was younger, it would have changed everything for me.
Hmm.
Um, because like I don't know, you can spend hours and hours, working yourself into the ground and being this absolute machine. And I feel like oftentimes we kind of glorify that and we
Hmm.
celebrate those people that are grinding and like, oh, I just wish I had that motivation and that drive. But when I started taking care of myself and going to therapy and taking not a lot, it doesn't take a lot of time, maybe an hour or two out of your week to prioritize the things that make you the best version of yourself. I was shocked at how much of a better artist it made me.
Yeah.
I was shocked at how much of a better human I was and how I could show up in ways in my art and in my performance and in my life.
Yep. I think that's so well said. I mean, I think it's certainly true. I think your larger point in some ways is about the long-term sustainability of a career of you can't work at an unsustainable rate and have a 40-year career. I think that's unquestionably true. I also think in some of the ways you're talking about in the short term, it's something I've been really emphasizing to our students right now as we record this at the beginning of January. They'll be listening right as like New York City Unified is hitting. And that like right now, I think some of those self-care things are actually as important from a competitive standpoint as drilling your song that one more time. But like for most of our students who've been working with us for many months, yes, there's still technical things to do. Yes, you can make some technicals, and those are have some importance, but are almost less important than like bringing a healthy human being into the room who's like alive and can play. And like then I'm like, okay, great. If they're subtle adjustments, and of course it's like there's the student who started a week ago. I'm like, no, you do still need to memorize your monologue. But for most students, that's not the issue. It is more like, how do I bring this psychologically and physically and vocally healthy person into a room to exist? You feel like you're ready to talk. You talk. Go. Cut me off anytime. Go.
Okay, I just wanted to I feel like to your students that are listening to this, I was literally telling this story to someone the other day, and it totally has to do with what you said. Sometimes at Elon, I would help you would like help with auditions, and one of the things you would do, you would just like sign up and be like, how do I help? And one of the jobs was stapling the headshots and the resumes. And that was when you would sit in the vocal auditions. And it was so fascinating to me because I don't know if I'm gonna get in trouble for saying this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. I
Get
don't
in
really
trouble.
care.
That's what we're here for.
Like listen, every student who is auditioning for colleges, listen to me when I say this. From the second that a student would walk into that
Mhm.
recital, they would open the door, they would walk in, they'd be like, "Hi." We would all be like, "Oh, that's an Elon student.
Uh-huh.
I hope they can sing." They
Yep.
didn't even open their mouth yet.
Yep.
They would just be like, "Oh, that's an Elon kid. Hope that they
Yep.
can sing." It was like, that's it. And
Yep.
that was so shocking for me to see that it's like, oh, it is actually like, because there's a point where it's like, that is something I always remind myself. It's like there is a point where everyone is good. Everyone is good to like there
Yep.
is a point that you get to, especially with the schools that pre-screen. It's like everyone around you is talented.
Mm.
There is a point that you get to where it is not about how good you are. It is about who you are. And
Mhm.
especially at certain schools, like Elon it specifically is about that. Like Elon cares about who you are as a like they are so person forward, or at least that's always like how
Mhm.
and I'm sure other schools are as well. I just like use Elon because that's where I spent 4 years of
For
my life.
sure.
Um, but like that is what they would do. Like they would walk
Yep.
in the room and you'd be like, "Oh, that's an Elon person," and they wouldn't even sing a note.
Yep.
And so when you think about things like taking care of yourself and prioritizing, like if you were so focused on your material and your music, like, yeah, you could be the best singer in the world. But if you're a brick wall, like that's going to hurt you more
Yep.
than it's going to help you.
It's so true. And I think maybe some of the actionable advice from there, it's like, of course, there's something ineffable about who you are if you're all revealing who you are successfully. It's like some people will be Elon people, some people won't be Elon people. But there are people out there who might have been Elon people, who might be Elon people, but who were in their own way, who were not, who didn't do the work to show up and have that energy revealed, where Cara goes, yep, you can see that from across the room, that if you're in your head and if you're not doing, that's why we're always talking about that psychological prep of how you get yourself prepared to walk in the room. If you're not able to do that and show up as your full self, you might have been an Elon person and not reveal. And that's the only tragedy. If you show up, we always say, if you show up and you do your best work and you show up as your authentic self and someone says no, it's actually not that big of a rejection because you go, great, this wasn't the right fit. We did it. We had a date. There was no chemistry, moving on. But if you go, there actually might have been chemistry, but I didn't show up, with my full self. That's where you go, oh, the regrets of what it could have been.
Yes, and that's why I say the college audition process is so hard because it's like I feel like it's one of the only times in your life that you're going to be asked to be like, "This is me,"
Yeah.
and in an audition, and they'll be like, "Yes, no," you know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
in life when we're auditioning for things now, it's
Totally.
we're trying to like fit a certain slot, but in college it's so vulnerable because you're 18 years old and you're being expected to be like, "This is who I am," and I'm like, "God, I don't even know who I am." Like
No,
I'm 25
but
and I'm still
and
trying to
it,
figure it out.
even if I was, if you're 40, it's like there is, and I wouldn't say that I am. Let's be clear, I would never. But it's like there's still, you would never have auditions that are this vulnerable. I mean, not
Yeah.
never. Maybe it's a one person show or something. I don't know, some weird. But like it's like you're never auditioning for yourself, really. You're trying to bring yourself to the role, but you easily could hear back from casting, oh, they loved you. You were 6 inches too tall. Where it's
Yeah.
like, there's no, you're 6 inches too tall for college. They could accept someone for that, or it's like they're that it is about who you are that's being accepted or rejected. And even though, of course, the same experience is happening, it's not actually you. It's the representation of you that they're seeing in the room that they're, for 5 minutes or for 10 minutes or whatever it is that they're saying no to. But it feels like it's you because you're doing the work to vulnerably reveal yourself. So when someone says no, thank you, especially if you feel like yes, it's very painful. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about, on this sort of subject, I want to talk about the genesis for the need for perfection. And maybe I'll try to explain that a little bit. Because I do really understand it, of course, in a social media world and in a professional world, that in some ways, perfection of a certain kind it's preferred. I mean, you can see someone go, oh, that this over this from an algorithmic perspective. You look at who's cast in certain things, you go, oh, well, look at her body, or look at, this person's amazing vocals, or, there's a certain element of perfection that makes sense. I kind of wonder in the college audition world, like, where do you think students are getting that message? Because I will certainly pat the back of this podcast in terms of how much we emphasize the goal is like bringing that raw, individual, authentic artist, right? But I also really don't think this podcast is now unique in giving that messaging. I mean, it may have been more distinguishing 20 years ago compared to other college coaches, but now 9 out of 10 sources a student is going to look for. If they're looking for expert information, it's going to say, bring in your authentic self. Listen to the 200 colleges that have been on this podcast, 150 colleges that have been on this podcast. They're all saying that. It's not just Elon. They're all saying, who are you? We're looking for unique artists. We're looking for whatever. But yet, even while that's happening, while more and more of that messaging is getting out there, more and more of our students, I think, are striving for perfection. It is not the case that, 15 years ago, that was not the only, we had students who were perfectionists, but that would have been a subset of our students. I feel like now it's more and more of our students who think it's about kicking your face and singing the high C. So I guess I wonder, is it as simple as just social media is the death of all? But I guess, where do you see the sort of genesis of why your generation or generations younger are really struggling with that perfection?
I do. I do think it's social media, which is so funny coming from the influencer, but
And we're
um,
going to talk about that. Yeah.
yeah, but I do think it's interesting because the way I talk about social media, specifically within our industry, is that it's a tool, right?
Yeah.
But social media in and of itself is a highlight reel. You get to choose what goes out there.
Mm-hmm.
And my hot take about when it comes to like toxic cultures within the college audition cultures and like the like our like little New York City audition bubble is that any sort of culture that is there, we cultivate it.
Yeah.
It's a hamster wheel that we cultivate that
Yeah.
like we kind of have to clock within ourselves. And it's kind of a hot take that not everyone agrees with, but I really do think it is social media because I think these students, so I'll give you an example. Say that I was going through an audition and I met these girls at like a an early audition that I went to in December, and I followed a bunch of them, and they posted, all of these photos of themselves and like videos and reels of them, like kicking their face and doing all of these things and seeing all these incredible things. I would think to myself, "Oh my gosh, they're perfect. They're
Mm-hmm.
so talented. I need to be that." And right now, I'm not that. And even if I was that, my social media doesn't show that I am. So
Mm-hmm.
nobody's going to think that I am. Nobody's going to know that I am. Meanwhile, those girls might not think that they are either. So, what am I going to do to prove to other people that I am enough? I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start posting that, but I'm never, ever going to share the moments where maybe I don't crack. Maybe
Yeah.
I don't get into every school I think about. Maybe I don't post every acceptance. Like, I know when I started doing social media, my vow was that this will not be a highlight reel. My goal was to be the person that I need to see when I was 14, the person who not didn't just show the high highs of this industry,
Mm-hmm.
but also the low lows. Someone who was like, yeah, one time I had two back-to-back jobs, and then I was a waiter for a year. Like
Mm-hmm.
this is how it is, guys. Like this, like there's it's not always glitz and glamour. Like sometimes you're gonna get 90 back-to-back no's. Sometimes you're gonna be one of five people cut from a dance call.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think because social media is such a highlight reel and we never, ever, ever show the low moments, we think that everyone around us is just living this perfect standard of a life. And I think specifically these people and these kids that are auditioning for colleges see this imaginary life as truth. And it's
Yep.
so
Yep. I think that so makes sense, and I love the idea, and I'm curious about it. I'm sort of interested in investigating the like how much we're doing it to ourselves when we do it. Like, do you feel like the students are also getting the messaging of the goal is to be raw and imperfect and unique, and but they're just not believing it? Like, do you feel like it's like, okay, yeah, you say that, but then I see the kids that get in and they look perfect to me, and so I don't really believe the professors who are saying I'm looking for this thing? You're
it's
nodding, so yes.
It's so hard because I mean, I do that now, like,
Yeah,
as a, like, post-grad
absolutely.
professional person, like, it's it's something that, like, I still have to remind myself of,
Yep.
because I try to tell myself the same things, and sometimes you see, like, announcements and things, and you, like, kind of like the same things, and it's hard, you have to keep reminding yourself, but kind of to go back to the thing that we have always been saying, there is so much merit and so much value in staying so, pardon my French, like, fucking true to
Hmm.
who you are and authentic to yourself.
That was not French, Kara. Just so you know, you said you took French in college. You said you were forced to take French in college. I
Oh,
just
and
want to be
I
clear
barely
that was
passed it.
back with that kind of French. I'm shocked that you passed. No, I think that's so true. And And I think, of course, the challenge of social media, and I do understand, again, 150 schools saying a version of we're looking for unique raw artists and then almost kind of glossing over them, like, but also a lot of these people are handsome and tall and great dancers and sing very well, and that there is talent as an element of it too, that they're not always as forthright as I think they could be about it. But I think there is an element of it, and this is really me hazarding a guess because I can't imagine exactly what it's like to be a 17-year-old today. We had different struggles, and not that different, but different enough that it's difficult for me to really get in the head. But some element of it, that is, it is easier in some ways, I think, to focus on perfection than to live in the like messiness of like, it's harder to be vulnerable. It's harder to be like, maybe they just didn't want me. It's easier for me to say, oh, they took the handsomer guy. That's because he's got a six pack and I don't have it. Is easier for me to deal with that rejection than to say, like, what if they just liked his talent more, or what if they, that's a harder. And I think on the college level, I do think some of our students will focus more on it's, we're talking about in some ways looks-based perfection, but some of it's even they'll focus on the high kick or focus on the high C. And that's the most important thing when you, even if they do at some level believe the other messier thing is more important, it's like, it's more vulnerable. It's harder to focus on that, I think. So there's
Yeah,
some maybe accountability there. No, go.
I think it's hard because, like, at the end of the day, like, our lives are so public. I thank God that I was not auditioning for colleges when social media and TikTok was a thing, because I don't know what it would have done to me, but it
Yeah.
wouldn't have been anything good.
Yeah.
Um, but I think just like our lives are so public now.
Yeah.
Everything about our lives, that information is so accessible.
Yeah.
And I have this conversation with students a lot who are like, I don't like social media. I don't like Instagram, but everyone tells me I have to use it in order to be an actor as a tool. And it's like, yes and no. And I think there are so many ways around it that
Yeah.
I'm like, here's how you do it without having to use it.
Yeah.
Um, but it is hard because it's like our lives are so public. I think I kind of have had to find that balance a lot, because I joke that I share my whole life on the internet with the exception of some ginormous parts of it.
Yeah.
But it's like it's finding that balance, you
Yeah.
know?
Yep, that's so well said. It's so well said. Yeah, and I think it's complicated, and I certainly want to be empathetic to those out there who are struggling with that. But I do think I want to make sure the message of like, while I think if you hear there's an element of shellacking over a very understandable desire to look a certain way, sound a certain way, dance a certain way, those sort of objective goals. I think the important thing that I want to make sure we emphasize is like, the goal is still that raw, messy, authentic thing. Messy doesn't have to mean a mess, but like that the vulnerability is the goal, that these professors are not BSing you, certainly at the college level. We can talk a little bit, and I want to talk as we get into the professional level, how that's elements of that are true and potentially shift a little bit when you're talking about, being cast in something that's going to pay you money. But, from the college level, that is the goal, and it is hard. So I'm empathetic with it's hard to focus on living in that raw and unknown place. But I guess just they're saying that is, it's not BS. That is actually still the goal, is to find that if you possibly can.
Yes. And I think too, there are also it makes my heart so happy to see that the people that are on these apps,
Yeah.
the people that have been given platforms,
Yes.
are not people who are preaching any of that like perfect thing. They're
Yes.
people like I maybe DM her this every other week where I'm like, Ellery, if I had seen this video when I
Yep.
was 18, it would have changed my life. Like Ellery Ward, people like her, like people who are just so unapologetically
Yep.
like this, like they are who are such incredible role models in
Yep.
this industry of being like of authenticity.
Yep.
That makes my heart happier than anything else. So that the fact that like the role models on social media are not examples of that makes me happy.
It's no, it's so true. I guess that's part of the irony of why I bring it up. It feels like the messaging has gotten better and the disease has gotten worse. Somehow, like
Yes,
I'm like, the
it's so
messaging is
bizarre.
great, but it's so much. All right, let's take another short break, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about all of this. So we're back in a flash with Cara. All right, we are back with Cara Rose DiPietro, and we're gonna keep going. Some of these conversations we've been having really, they're sort of about process over product. It's certainly something that we kind of emphasize in this process, because the college audition process is a process, and they're looking for students who are going to spend 4 years at their school and are in process. They don't need a final finished product for a 17, 18-year-old. But I'd love to kind of talk about how that has changed and shifted for you in your life as you now are a social media influencer and a professional actor who is paid and at times paid and cast to fit into a certain costume that you can't completely avoid, not always cast a certain costume, but that someone might want a certain look or a certain product from you in a different way that in the college world. How has that shifted for you in terms of your journey and how you think about process and product as you sort of become a literal product now?
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating because I something in college that a lot of us like struggled with is like branding.
Hmm.
They talk about it a lot, being like, what is your brand? What
Hmm.
is your type? Who are you? And I have been a very one of the like kind of fortunate few that has never been a question in my life. I just with the way that I sound and the way that my face looks and my
Hmm.
height, it is so evident and obvious and clear what I do, how I do it, if that makes
Hmm.
sense. Like
Yep.
the box that I fit into and what I do is so clear.
Uh-huh.
I like I never really had a hard time figuring out my path.
Yep.
And I will say the interesting thing in the last year of my life has been turning 25, turning 24, and starting to say, "Hey, I do more."
Hmm.
Like my age, the thing joked about is like I haven't played someone over the role of 18 since I
Yep.
graduated college until I played Audrey this last summer in Little Shop of
Yep.
Horrors, which was so funny. And don't get me wrong, like I will milk those young roles until I literally can't
I
anymore.
mean, Celia Keenan Bolger was talking about it. She's like in her
Yeah,
40s. She's
right.
like, I'm still doing it.
I
I'm not gonna say I won't do it anymore. Yeah.
no, I will milk it to the day that I die.
Yep.
But it's also something that like I also allowed that mindset and that box to limit myself and tell
Yep.
myself what I could and can't do. So actually, literally, it's so funny. Behind you is a little note on my screen. I'm redoing my entire audition book because I took
Hmm.
a look at it and was like, I it was so it was it was very specific, and I was putting myself into this box that I had kind of put myself into a really long time, um, and kind of wouldn't let myself explore anything else.
Hmm.
Um, and so the last couple of months have been kind of full of a lot of like, okay, wait, you do more. And so kind of
Yep.
let myself explore those other parts of me as an artist and flex those other muscles. And I think it's just kind of something I have to remember, and I'm trying
Yep.
to allow myself to remember, is that like the learning doesn't stop when you graduate college. The funny thing is I really didn't study voice until I got to college.
Uh-huh.
So I really feel like when I graduated, I was ready to start, if that makes sense.
Yep.
And I really, in the last 2 years of my life, feel like I have finally settled into who I am and what I do. So if you're like listening to this and you are in college and you are still trying to find your footing, like I don't want you to feel I hope this brings you comfort that like when I graduated college, I was like, yeah, I know who I am and what I do. And now I'm 25 and I'm like,
Hmm.
no, yeah, now I know who I am and
Hmm.
what I do. It's you're not done when you graduate college. Like you've got a roadmap and
Yep.
now you're ready to like keep driving the car, if that makes sense.
Just wait till Saturn returns for you, Cara.
Yes.
Just wait till it's coming a couple years. No, that's but I wonder, is there any element of that, from we talk about the mental health journey, is there any element of that in terms of, both you're talking about your type or your brand in the professional world, but I'm also talking about like now with social media, like literally like you have an Amazon storefront and you are selling yourself, and to some extent, I don't know what consciousness I really, because I cannot picture being an influencer and doing a makeup tutorial or something, but you are in some ways selling your beauty while talking about deep, beautiful, mental health oriented things. Like, is that ever in conflict, or do you ever feel an incongruousness to that, or a difficulty that like rears the ugly head of like, okay, now I need to take a second for myself to, to just check in with what is that product that is my body and my face and my voice and those kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, my rule, I mean, this because ever all of this totally happened by accident. I never ever planned for this to be a part of my life the way that it is. But my rule has always been if it if 14-year-old Kara needed to hear it, and it doesn't take anything from 25-year-old Cara to say it, I'll say it. And oftentimes, I always ask myself that. And if it takes something from me to say it, I won't. And oftentimes it will. And I'll be like, okay, I'm going to
Hmm.
step on the brakes. And maybe sometimes I'll revisit it and it won't. Um, but I will say that I feel like it's taught me a lot about myself as a person. And
Hmm.
it's given me a sense of purpose outside of my art,
Yep.
if that makes sense. So like when I sometimes I feel like a lot of what we do as artists and as actors can be a bit self-indulgent in the sense of like when I'm on stage or when I'm performing or auditioning, I get very in my head about like what I'm doing and how it's reading to other people and how other people are going to perceive me. But then at the stage door, I'll get a mom coming up to me and saying, "Hey, I want to thank you for X, Y, and Z, and for being someone that my daughter can watch while
Hmm.
she's recovering from her eating disorder."
Hmm.
Um, and then all of the sudden, what I'm doing and what I'm working for isn't about me.
Yep.
It's about showing that, like, you can be all of this. You can have a life that you love. You can be absolutely anything. You don't have to just do this one thing. You can be a multi hyphenate person. And it's not just about being this music theater robot. It's about being a fully formed human.
Yep.
Um, and so it's become this like driving force behind my whole life and my career, and it's given me a sense of purpose.
Yep.
It's like taken me out of the equation while also putting me in it in a totally different way.
It's so cool, and I love it. Sort of how that comes around to the conversation about control and some of the stuff you talked about earlier in your college life, as you're going, oh gosh, what can I hang on to with control? The advice so many actors get, especially you get to that place in your career, you're going, I don't know what to do next, and so you should write your own show. You should, it was just like if you're someone who can do that, absolutely, that's fantastic, right? A great way to kind of control. Don't wait around for work. Make your own work if you can do it. Of course, not everybody is a writer. Not everybody's somebody who goes, I can just write a one-person show, or if you can, great. But I do think that an element of that advice of going, how do you have something in your life that you really have control over? Whether it is a great side job that you love, some people that is teaching, some people that is, social media, whatever the thing that you're going to go, I really have an element of control, and I can manage my own success in a way that you can certainly influence your success in this business, but you're never going to have full control over it. You can't control the big, huge movie that's going to come in, or you can set yourself up for success, but you are at the whims of this business as an actor.
Yeah, and it's something I always say about it. And at the end of the day, my rule is the second that I feel like I have to, I stop. And
Hmm.
that is the reason why I like when people ask me about social media and like how I've been able to do it, I that is the rule that I tell them. The
Yes, that's
second
so
that you feel
smart.
like you
Yep.
have to do it is the second that you start to loathe it. And it's about burnout. I say that about theater all the time. I'm like, sometimes you have to put the brakes on because
Yep.
if you start to hate the thing that you love, why are you doing it?
Yep.
What's the
Yep.
point? And so when I first started doing social media, I had no financial stake in it. It
Right.
wasn't helping my career in a way that I
Right.
knew about at the time. Like,
Right.
I wasn't doing it intentionally. I was working my serving job 40 hours a week, but I had this little thing in my pocket that was letting me be creative
Yep.
while I was working in New York City that I
Yep.
like it was a thing that was allowing me to feel like I was doing something creative that was bringing me joy
Yep.
that felt like it gave me some semblance of control over my life and my career. And I
Yep.
circled even back to that this last fall. I was having a conversation with a friend because I felt very out of control with my life and
Yep.
my career, and I was feeling frustrated. And she kind of gave me this reminder, and she was like, hold on, look at what you have in front of you, use it. And
Yep.
I was like, wait, you're right. Like,
Yep.
look at what you have in front of you and look at the people around you too that you admire and look at the things that they have done and created. Oftentimes, it resulted from them being like, I want this. How am
Yep.
I going to do it? How am I going to
Yep.
make it?
It's so well said. And we talk a lot about the intentionality of like, what is it to step in a room and go, I get to do this versus going, I have to do this. My life
Yes.
has set
Oh
me up in a way to be like, I guess I have to do all these posts. And it's like, you don't actually have to. If you look at the opportunity, I get to do this, and what do I want to do with it? It's the same action, but it's with such a different intention, and it comes out so differently. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with consumption of social media? Are you someone who spends a lot of time on TikTok, Instagram? How do you spend your time? How do you curate your feed if you do? I'd love to hear about sort of how you avoid the pitfalls of consumption that I know people struggle with.
it's so hard. We're trying. That's something I'm really working on right now, actually. It's something I
It's
tried.
January, time for
I know,
resolutions. Here we go.
truly. It's interesting too because in the last couple of months, social media too, in terms of my life has shifted in a way that like I am at the moment full-time freelancing. So like I fully really am working for myself. And so finding that balance of like how much do I consume so that I'm on top of like from a strategic
Yeah.
standpoint, and how on top of trends am I? How much am
Hmm.
I editing? How much am I posting a day? How much am I making sure that I'm engaging in content, posting in content? But also like not wanting to fall into that pitfall, because I find often the more I consume, the less creative I feel,
Absolutely.
but I still want to stay on top of things. So it's a lot of trial and error I've found. I do sometimes I like to set timers for myself. I
Hmm.
have a friend who sets app blocks on her phone. That's really helpful for her. Um, I know you can like limit certain words. Like if you have like a really hard time with certain content and it's not great for you,
Hmm.
I love the mute button on Instagram. Oh my gosh. If there is
Hmm.
someone in your life that you love so much and you just have a really hard time watching their content because maybe it makes you feel really competitive with
Yep.
yourself, you can mute them and
Yep.
they will never see it, but it just means that you won't be actively showed their stuff.
Yep.
It's the best button in the world. I think it's so great. Um, it's like it's a lot of trial and error,
Yep.
you know?
That's almost like, and I think so smart the idea of too much consumption can limit creativity. You obviously you're not going to never consume as a creative. It's you have to have something coming in for you to make output. But sometimes we think the more we consume, the more creative ideas we'll get, and I think really sometimes not. You get over full, and then it makes you logy or whatever. Not to make it all a hunger thing. I wanted to talk a little bit about gender in all of this, because it was something that really sparked for me watching your talk. I promise some personal stories here. I found myself thinking about my own drama school experience, and I was thinking about all my female identifying schoolmates and what I know they all went through. It was very kind of public. A lot of our classmates and schoolmates were going through specifically anorexia, bulimia. We knew that was happening, and then I had to shake myself in a little bit and be like, but why are you only thinking about the women in your class? Because you, Charlie, also gained and lost 30 pounds twice during those years. Like that also was happening to me. And I went to the gym obsessively at one point on the direct behest of a teacher. I think a very well-intentioned teacher, but they were like, you will get more roles if you fill out in these ways. Like I played baseball and they're like, you're a little like bottom heavy. They're like, right now you have really strong legs, but like you should fill out your chest a little bit. Like, and I was like, oh my God, that's a very specific comment to get from a 50-some-year-old teacher who's telling you what to do with your body. So, and I just know from my experiences, I was far from the only guy. As soon as I started doing that, I'm like, and what about this guy? What was going on there? So I'm wondering, in all of your Me Too's that you heard hearing back from this, were you hearing back from male identifying students? Was it mostly female identifying? And how that gender experience may have differed? I know, of course, gender is a very complicated spectrum, but did you hear different experiences from different sort of gender identifying groups?
I would say about a third of the experiences were from men.
Hmm.
And I would probably say that was only a third because I probably interacted with less men. And something I'm actually really glad that you brought this up, because I think it I feel like it is just a different ballgame for the two when we think about like traditionally female identifying actors and male identifying actors. They
Hmm.
are held to two different standards. And when we think about specifically in the performing arts, when we think about like size inclusivity and body positivity, when we think about like eating disorders and we think about all of these things in our industry, we have such a specific mindset and we feel like we are making moves and we're making
Yeah.
strides when it comes to female identifying. And then we turn to the male identifying actors and
Yeah.
dancers, and nothing has changed because
Yeah.
we're not talking about it,
Yeah.
because it's celebrated and it's expected. And also it's interesting because these standards are also tied to cultural things outside of the
Yeah.
theater sphere. Like a huge part of it comes from gay culture. And that was something that I learned a lot about when I was in
Hmm.
college and talking to some of my peers. Like, it's not just about theater. A lot of it comes from like the social culture that comes from being a gay man in
Yep.
New York City and the social pressures that come from that.
Yep.
Um, and it's so fascinating because it's just and it's while it's like people like when we were talking about it like with if when people talk to me about my experience, they're like, gosh, that's so horrible that you went through that. If they were to, I talked to a friend of mine who was like, I didn't start getting jobs until I got a six pack. And then
Yep.
all of a sudden people started paying attention to me and I got representation and my whole life changed.
Yep.
And it's like that is the stuff that we're not talking about it. And it's celebrated and it's praised and rewarded.
Yep.
And sometimes I'll look at an ensemble, I'll look at a cast announcement, and they'll be like, wow, look at the body diversity in this. It's like, yeah, awesome. Look at the body diversity in the female cast.
Yep.
Look at the men.
Yep.
And no one's talking about it.
Yep. It's so interesting. Like so many of these conversations with identity, it's like it's complicated because I think it is unquestionably, from a statistical perspective, it has been, and I think still is, worse for women. Like the experience is more, it seems like it's more insidious. It's more certainly historically damaging, but it also does feel like it's more overt sometimes with men. Like there's certain things that you'll hear of, like a praising of a male body, that I would go, you actually wouldn't say. Like, I know you're a liberal, very careful. You would not say that about a woman's top half the way that you're saying that about a man's top half. Like really, in objectifying and certain things that it's just a little bit more acceptable. Yeah, and so it's really complicated. But I guess I wanted to throw out there, so I promise vulnerability. I'm like, men too. I mean, that's certainly something that many have struggled with, and I think feel maybe a difficulty bringing up, in a way that I think it is certainly more acceptable now than it was then, certainly across the board. But I do think a lot of men, maybe especially like a straight man, would really have trouble saying, like, as I'm doing right now, have trouble saying, like, hey, this is something I struggle with too. That, like, it's one of the ways toxic masculinity can sort of be toxic to us all, of being like, hey, it's hard to be like, that kind of hurt. I kind of wish you didn't talk about that person's body instead of my body, or whatever, like in the
Well,
same ways that it could have experience for
yeah,
women.
well, boys don't have eating disorders.
Yeah.
That's the thing girls have.
Yeah.
And that's what men are taught. That's the narrative that they are fed, which is why statistically we don't see like many men, like when we look at the statistics, a lot less men are diagnosed. Of course they're not diagnosed
Right.
because no, they're not going to come forward. Like that's because that is the culture that they are enthralled in.
Yep.
Absolutely. And in
Yep.
theater, 1000%.
Yep. All right, I'd love to move this conversation to a wrap with two bits of advice. So if you prepared for a double barrel of
Okay.
advice, I'd wanted to circle back. I'd put this a little earlier in terms of the conversation about control, and I guess we talked a little bit about some of the control of your life. Have you found any tips or any sort of ways to help you release that need for control that you found in college? Now as a young professional, and still very young, but have you found a little bit of hey, I'm able to actually not white knuckle this as much for yourself?
Yeah. The phrase, I have never looked back on a no and not understood why. I have never, and sometimes it's taken me years, sometimes it's taken me days, weeks, months, whatever. But every time I've like gone through some kind of a rejection and it was something that I really wanted, or it was something that I was really devastated about, I've been able to look back and been like, oh gosh, if I had gotten that thing, I wouldn't have met that person. I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't have been able to go to that audition. I wouldn't have been able to do this or that or that. And I wouldn't have, and the thing that it led me to has always been an incredibly life-changing thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like the example I give was the first summer that I didn't book work. I felt like such a failure. Oh my
Mm-hmm.
gosh, I felt like it was the end of the world and that like it was just that was it was doomsday. I was never going to work again and everyone hated me. And that was my first summer in New York, and it was the summer that my social media took off.
Mm-hmm.
It was the summer that started my life here, and changed my life here. If I
Mm-hmm.
had not been here in the city, I wouldn't be talking to you today.
Yep.
And I could give you a billion more examples, but that knowledge, even though it's so hard in the moment, even when I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, I know this is going to be true, but right now it sucks.
Mm-hmm.
That knowledge, being able to look back at every single time and knowing that it's never been wrong, helps me to release the control of being like, you know what? There is literally already a plan.
Mm.
So all I can do is my best and know that there is already a plan and it's great. I just
Mm.
got to keep doing what I do.
So well said. I often use the example of COVID, of course, was a horrible experience, but if it wasn't COVID, I probably wouldn't have my daughter. At least wouldn't have this specific daughter. That maybe would have had a daughter later, who knows? But we had a baby because we had all this time off. Like, who knows if that would happen? We don't know, but and that doesn't mean like COVID was a net good then necessarily. But it's like that's the way life, one door closes and the other door opens. It's the way that life works.
Yeah.
All right, you crushed the first barrel. Now here we go with the second barrel. This is a little tougher, but I'm going to give you the challenge because here we are. This is going to be releasing late January, so people are just about to hit New York City Unified, Chicago Unified, LA Unified, depending when they're listening. They could be at different points of that. And I'd given that little challenge to our students, and I'll definitely be talking about it in the next couple pods in general. But like, as they try to bring in this psychologically, mentally, vocally, physically healthy body into a room, we know how important that is to be able to bring that full self into the room. Is there any advice of like in the next couple days, if they have unifieds a couple days from now, a week from now, or whatever? Is there any advice from you in terms of just what they can do to bring in their best, authentic, healthy self?
I would say build yourself like a mini toolkit. And I don't mean like a physical one, something that helps me because I'm like, I've, sorry, my dog is snoring so loud. Oh my gosh. I don't know if you can
We
hear
don't
her.
even hear you. We don't even hear your snoring dog.
Um, wow,
The
she is,
listeners are just think it's them just being
yeah.
subtly lulled to sleep.
Wow. I would say build yourself a little like toolkit and a little checklist. I'm someone who like has to make lists of things and plan things, or else my little like ADHD brain will never do them and I'll explode. But something that's
Mm-hmm.
helpful to me before like big moments and big auditions is the day before I will like plan out or like set like schedule out the things that I know I'll need. So like the things that I need when I know I'm about to have a stressful day is like I know that I need an hour in the morning to just like sit. I need to drink
Mm-hmm.
my coffee. I need to journal. I need to eat my breakfast. I need to give myself time to get ready slowly.
Mm-hmm.
I need to like set myself up for success in those ways. I need to have my outfit planned out. Everything, all the choices are made.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the things that I need. Maybe you need different things, but I would just try to make I would set myself up for success in every single way I possibly could. Um, and that's what I would do.
Yep.
I think the only thing that you can control in those moments is showing up as the best version of yourself. And that also means like setting yourself up for success personally and remaining
Mm-hmm.
calm and focused and centered. And the way that you can do that is by setting yourself up for success in the best way possible. So I would just like build yourself a little toolkit and then
Yep.
you can keep that list with you through every audition. And maybe you
Yep.
can like but you can figure out like, oh, when I'm traveling to auditions, I can
Yep.
pack this like one specific thing or these specific like this little snack box of bars that I can always have with me, or I can bring this outfit with me, or I can have this journal, or I can have X, Y, and Z with me so I can always have it with me. Like things that provide you with consistency so you don't
Yep.
always feel like you're on the fly.
Yep. It's such good advice, and it's certainly advice that we give of, yeah, how do you prepare your preparation? That you need to be able to know how you need to best prepare. And I think there's some best practice. A lot of things you're talking about, like a lot of people should do that. There should be this kind of physical warm up and a vocal warm up. Those are all things that you should have planned and shouldn't be winging on the fly. But different people will have different things that are most important to them. But it is, the more you control those things, the more that you can then actually try to show up and not control what happens in the room, because you're going to have that instinct to grip, as we've been talking about in so many different ways. We have the instinct to control, but to know if I try to control the room and in a robotic way, that's not going to be helpful for me artistically, but I can control the way that I come in prepared. I can show up as my full self and be ready to improv, be ready to be flexible in those moments.
There's this incredible Mel Robbins who I feel like everyone has probably heard of. She's a public speaker. She has a podcast. She's just brilliant. And she has this whole talk about confidence. And she's like, confidence is not a feeling. Confidence is the willingness to try.
Mm-hmm.
And hearing that changed my life. And so
Mm-hmm.
when I go into auditions and I psych myself out, and I think like, oh, I just wasn't confident. I think back and I'm like, okay, well, why?
Yep.
Didn't prepare.
Yep.
Maybe I didn't because I was like, oh, well, I'm not going to get it anyway, so I didn't prepare enough. Maybe I didn't
Yep.
set myself up for success enough. Whereas when a week before choose my cut,
Yep.
I set my alarm, I wake up with enough time, I get ready an hour before I need to leave, do X, Y, and Z. I walk in there feeling confident because I tried.
Yep.
And all of a sudden I feel great. and I
There's
leave
no
the
doubt.
room.
Yep.
And even if I don't get it, I'm like, well, I feel pretty confident, pretty good because I
Yep.
tried.
To be truly prepared will enable you to be flexible if you're prepared in the right way. Of course, you could prepare in a way that's like if you're preparing badly and you're sort of setting it and going, it's going to go. But we know not to do that. But sometimes people think actually, if I'm a little less prepared, I'll be more improv. It's like no. Actually, when you come in less prepared, you feel vulnerable and you grip. Your body goes, oh God, fight or flight. Here we go. And now you're going to do it in a tight way as opposed to like, hey, I could do this 6 different ways. They've all worked in my living room. I know what I'm doing. Let's see what happens. Let's give it a go. Like you're much freer when you're more prepared. All right, we have to, I said we'd wrap it up. Here you are. You're recommending other coaching companies. You're recommending other podcasts.
Sorry.
Getting yourself in. We know if we want to check you out more or other pods or other coaching companies, we can go to @Cara Rose DiPietro on Instagram. That's CARAROSE DIPIETRO. I only really need to spell your last name, but I did the whole thing. But you're only legally allowed to do that if you're also following us on @Mapping the College Audition as well. It's the only way we'll let you follow Cara. Thanks for the time today, Cara. Really,
Oh
really
my gosh,
appreciate
thank you
it.
for having me.
Yes, yes, yes. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Cara. And for those watching the video, welcome to staring at my face for over an hour. Did our first video guest have to be this like young, attractive person? I feel like it could have been like an old college faculty member to make me look a little better by comparison. But there you have it. Lots of takeaways this week, so I'm going to try to fly through them. My first takeaway is, and I don't do this a lot, is a question to all of you. So please let us know via email with our mailbag at Mapping the College Edition or in social comments on the socials media. Would you be interested in more content relating to the transition from high school to college, so the transition out of high school and into college? I really like that Cara brought that up, and it's come up a few times before in the past couple of years, especially with parents and especially with that struggle of what it is to send their kids out of state. Some people it's sending them 30 minutes away, but a lot of parents struggle with the idea of sending them out of state. So if you all have questions in that area, it might be something we try to cover a little bit more explicitly on the podcast, as well as for MTCA in future webinars as well. I'll just tell you that has made its way to our docket for discussion, and I'd love to hear what you all think. Is that something that would be helpful commentary for all of you? And I always feel that way in general. If there's anything specific that we haven't addressed that you would like addressed on the pod, please do get that into their mailbag at mappingthecollegeedition.com or, of course, on social media. And then, yes, my second takeaway is just underlining some of what we were talking about in that conversation about perfection. I am fascinated by that question I asked Cara of why we think it's happening, because we all kind of acknowledge that as the messaging is getting better and more clear, the problem is getting worse. And I'm suspicious that the answer might be a bit more complicated than just social media. Maybe it's just a detailed answer of all the ramifications of our phone obsessed culture and how that relates to social media. But that is kind of more of a punditry question. I'm interested in it, but that's kind of inside baseball in the process. And I think a bit less relevant to all of you. I think from a takeaway perspective, the thing I'd want all of you to focus on, especially those of you who are about to engage in auditions in the coming days and weeks, is that please believe me about the goal being individuality and vulnerability and uniqueness and imperfections and not a shellacked, gorgeous, impenetrable performance, right? You've heard all the schools say it. You've heard me say it. So all I can do is beg you to believe me. I'm not lying to you. It's funny. I think it's one of the ways that my generations of performers is much different than performers today, or maybe most different from performers today, is we were almost competitive with how raw and how vulnerable we could be. Like sometimes it would almost be comical that we would pursue this idea of like being artists or artistes, right? And end up being almost caricatures of ourselves because we were trying to show how flexible, how bold, how crazy, how non-mainstream we were, right? And I think that's a bit related to the conversation about overconfidence, something a lot of my generation struggled with, and versus humility that we've had before in the podcast. Where students now are much more likely to be humble and more afraid to take up space. I've used that phrase, loud humility. My generation was not afraid to take up space and sometimes had that opposite problem of almost taking up too space or taking up too much space or taking up space in ways that weren't necessarily very helpful. But, and this gets back to the discussion we're having with Cara, I will say that I know that is easier said than done. So for those of you who believe me and believe all these professors, please know that I, and importantly here, they behind the table, they know that if you're working toward that goal, it's a difficult one to achieve. So it's okay, even if you are imperfect at being imperfect, right? That's okay. But really, it comes down to how you are holding your instrument. I mean, your instrument of your body, right? Just knowing that your default, if you let the adrenaline take over in the wrong way, your default may be to kind of seize control and hold the thing too tightly, right? And if you can allow yourself then to kind of gently encourage your body to release a little bit with each successive audition, right? If you think of your body like a musical instrument, you know that if it's gripped too tightly in certain ways, it won't be able to resonate fully, right? We want to meet you and your instrument as it actually is and see what it sounds like when it's not gripped too tightly. So please, I encourage you all to work toward that. Work toward the goal of allowing instead of forcing, of allowing instead of controlling, and see what happens. Like we said, this only works if you've put in the work and you're prepared. But I know that the vast majority of our listeners have put in the hard work and have prepared. They may have worked for a year, 2 years on this material, on this audition. They've been living it, they've been dreaming it. And now their challenge is really to let go and allow. In a lot of ways, that is like a long-winded way of just saying, have fun, right? Because, of course, that's the ultimate goal, is to have fun. And if you're having fun in the room, you're doing all of these things. But I think when people hear have fun, it can kind of go in one ear and out the other as kind of an empty statement of like, have fun. God, this is too important to have fun. It's just something that I don't think people always hear and let it really land on them what we mean when we say have fun. And I like the idea of kind of playing as an active and difficult goal. It's not easy to truly play. That's like the ultimate challenge, which then it allows me to actually have fun. If I'm striving for that idea of playing, then it is fun to achieve and succeed or fail at that goal, but to be striving toward it, right? And then that brings me to my last takeaway, which is related to this. And it's just, I loved Cara quoting Mel Robbins in that idea of confidence is not a feeling, it's a willingness to try. I think that is such a helpful way to think about it. We all know how important it is to be able to walk in those rooms with confidence, but that doesn't mean that you can suddenly somehow just feel confident. Whoever does, who feels confident, right? It feels related to that idea of like, bravery is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to persevere through it. I know I'm quoting someone there, but I don't know who, so apologies if that's your quote. If it's your quote, you're probably not listening to this podcast, but apologies for not attributing that quote to whoever it belongs to. But confidence, it is not something that needs to be felt. It's something that needs to be performed. And again, when I say performed, that doesn't mean you need to show me your confidence. I never need to see or feel that you are obviously confident, but I just need you to be able to take the leap, jump off the cliff, and trust you can build your wings on the way down. That's confidence, right? But if you feel terrified as you're making that leap, great. Who wouldn't feel terrified, right? Hopefully, it's a bit exhilarating too. It's not only terrified, it's not all of a negative feeling, but don't let yourself think something is wrong just because you don't feel confident and comfortable as you take a leap, that you don't know the wing building is going to go great, right? You don't have to feel any certain way. You just have to take that action to jump off the cliff and do the wing building, and then do it again and again and again. And you'll get a little bit better each time you do it, right? And so if you have those moments of, oh God, oh no, I'm up next, I have to go into this audition, and it's a big one. It's my Michigan audition. It's my Carnegie audition, whatever that audition that for you feels like a really big one. See if you can just give yourself that little pause and change your self-talk and say, I get to go into this audition and take the leap, right? Sort of like we talked about earlier, that the idea of shifting your nerves into excitement is much easier than trying to eliminate your nerves entirely. All you have to do is actively decide to jump. And then the confidence part, it really does come along for the journey, even if you don't feel confident right as you're about to take that leap. Okay, that's enough for a takeaway. Our first video takeaway. Let's go. If you see little cuts and edits in these things, in the intro, in the outro, just please know that is not because I sometimes make mistakes on these takeaways. We're just adding those little cuts in so that I can look cool, like I'm doing a TikTok video like the kids, right? But all of my actual intros and outros are done perfectly in one take. And I want you all to know that. That's very important. As my daughter says, Daddy doesn't make mistakes. And that is just true for me. Just to be clear, I would never say to you all, Daddy doesn't make mistakes, as if that's my voice saying that. That makes me uncomfortable, even thinking it. And speaking of edits, this podcast is produced by Meghan, Cordier, and Kelly Prendergast, with Jordan Rice lending us some social media genius. Please follow us at Mapping the College Audition on Instagram and MTCA wherever humanly possible. And check us out at mtca.com for more information on how we can help you with your individual college prep needs. To my young artists out there mapping their journeys, what does the word competitive mean to you?